This is Ari Koretsky, and welcome to Jews You Should Know, introducing the broader community to interesting and inspiring Jewish men and women making a difference in our world. Some are already famous, some not yet so, but each is a Jew you should know. And we are back with another fabulous episode of Jews You Should Know, this week featuring Penina Taylor. What an interesting story. Grew up as a Jew, but most of her early adult life spent as a Christian, as well as a Messianic Jew, reaching out to proselytize those in the Jewish community. A fascinating tale of personal spiritual development. I got to meet with Penina a couple months ago, live when she was in my area on a speaking tour. Actually having her back in a couple of weeks to my own program on campus to speak with my students. Meanwhile, all of our usual reminders to follow us on social media at Jews You Should Know, spelled out fully on Instagram and Facebook, Jews You Should Know with the letter U. On Twitter, reach out for speaking engagements, jewsyoushouldknow@gmail.com. Tales of a Jewish podcaster, lessons learned from over 100 of the most interesting and inspiring Jews alive today. As always, a reminder to subscribe wherever you may be listening, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, Stitcher, and please help others subscribe as well so we can spread the Jews You Should Know inspiration. And now to my conversation with spiritual seeker, author, and lecturer, Penina Taylor. We are here with author, speaker, lecturer, and someone with a fascinating and colorful life story, Penina Taylor. How are you, Penina?
Hi, Ari. Nice to meet you. Thank you for having me.
Likewise. I'm very excited we could do this. For those on the listening end, we are doing this one live. Very often we do the interviews over the internet, but here I had the privilege that Penina was in town doing a speaking engagement at the local Aish in Rockville, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., near where I live in Silver Spring, Maryland. And so I was able to zip over here this morning and actually do this in person, which is always much more fun. So thanks for making the time. So like we do with all of our guests, Penina, let's take it from the top. Tell us a little bit about where you're from and your upbringing.
Okay, thanks. Well, I was born into a secular Jewish home, right? So when I explain this to audiences, I like to say that it meant that what Judaism meant to me was it explained why I had a big nose, why I talked with my hands, and why I liked Chinese food. But other than that, Judaism really had no relevance to my life. It meant absolutely nothing.
Now, where did you grow up?
I was actually born in Lakewood.
Interesting.
Which nowadays, even just that part, never mind the rest of my story, would be unique because there's not that many secular Jews, I would dare say, in Lakewood anymore. Yeah. But back then there were.
Okay, so you're growing up as a kind of an assimilated Jew with a lot of Chinese food. And didn't have much connection to Judaism, it sounds like.
Right, exactly. And my parents were divorced when I was 4. And I suffered a bit of abuse at the hands of a friend of the family. Don't need to go into the details, but you can imagine that would set the stage for a little bit of a troubled childhood. When I was 10 years old, we moved to Miami, Florida. And it was in high school that I started asking a lot of existential questions, like, what's the point of life? If there's nothing out there greater and more meaningful than all of this pain and everything, then what's the point? And as I was talking with a classmate of mine in school, she said to me, well, Penina, we all have these questions. The answer is you need to have a relationship with God. And
how had you felt about God until that point?
So I hadn't really thought much about God, but part of the story that I left out was when I was in 4th and 5th grade, my paternal grandparents had arranged for me to attend an Orthodox day school in Lakewood. And so it's interesting because not a lot of what I learned there stuck, because I learned that what happens at home stays at home and what happens at school stays at school. My mother was secular, and she didn't want to hear anything about what I was learning at school. But so here I am all these years in the future in high school, and as she mentioned God, I thought, okay, that rings true for me. Maybe what she's saying is right. And so at the age of almost 16, I was introduced to God and to Jesus because my classmate was a born-again Christian. And so what's interesting about that is that, and it's funny, at my talk last night, I was confronted by a Christian woman who was in the audience, which was
interesting.
Really, and she was very, very upset. She felt very betrayed by my talk, because what happened was, my newfound faith gave me the strength to make all sorts of changes in my life. At that point, I was drinking, I was smoking, I was doing light drugs, skipping classes, hanging around with bad kids, the whole deal. And my newfound faith gave me the strength to make all sorts of changes, including stopping drinking and smoking and the drugs. I started attending classes. I had a better crowd of friends at school. And it was really pretty incredible story. But all that shows is that connecting to God, connecting to the divine, even if you aren't quite correct in the way that you're connecting, it's a powerful experience. It's a powerful thing. And so I began to make those changes in my life. And my mom was watching this as it was going on.
How are your secular Jewish parents feeling about this kind of transition into the world of Christianity?
Well, so I didn't know my dad. I had seen him one time in 15 years that my parents were divorced. And my mom, on the one hand, the little Jewish connection that she had kind of was not happy about it, but she herself had been searching. She herself had been looking for things. I think somebody at some point had given her a copy of the New Testament. In fact, I think I found it at some point while I was on this process, and I was like, why does my mom have this? Because I just had become a Christian, and I'm like, why did my mom have it? And she was upset, actually. She was, why do you have to? And I joined, the group that I joined at first was Southern Baptist. And so she had this kind of idea in her head that they're extremists. So she said to me, why do you have to be Southern Baptist? Why can't you just be a plain Christian? We would say a par of Christian, right? Just neutral. And I was like, because this is where I was introduced to Jesus. So she was not thrilled, but I think she was happy in the changes that she saw going on in my life.
How did the Christianity sort of manifest itself? In other words, were you just going to church every day? Were you going to Bible studies? Were you?
Yes.
What was the?
Yes.
How did that change your life?
Anybody who knows me knows that if I believe something's
Go
right,
all in,
I
huh?
go all in. Absolutely. I was attending Bible studies in school. I was in high school, so every Sunday I was going to church. Wednesday night meetings, anything that was available, I was part of it. And what was interesting was I began to, of course, share my faith with my mom, because Christians, that's the great commandment. We have 613 commandments, right? And everybody talks about the 10, but the one great commandment, that's what it's called, Great Commission is what it's called in the New Testament, is to share the Christian story, what they call the gospel.
And Southern Baptist is an evangelical movement, right?
Yeah.
Which means that there's, if I understand correctly, there's even a greater emphasis placed on spreading that message.
For sure. Anybody that kind of falls into the category of evangelical, that's what evangelical means. Right. It comes from the word evangelos, which means good news. So it's the idea that you need to share this with other people. And so I started sharing with my mom, and she thought to herself, as she had watched this transition, if something could have such a profound effect on her daughter's life, then it must be the truth. And so I brought my mother and my sister to Christianity as well.
I was going to ask if there were any siblings involved.
Just one sister, yeah.
Older, younger?
Younger.
Okay.
So I brought them to Christianity. When I graduated high school, I went to Bible college. I studied evangelism.
Where was this?
In Miami. In Miami,
Bible
it was.
College in Miami, huh?
Yeah, it was when I went. It was called Miami Christian College. Now I believe it's called Trinity University.
Okay.
So I went to Bible college. I got my certificate in evangelism. And then I started dating a guy who was the older brother of my best friend in high school. He also had been to Bible college. He went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. So anybody you know who's listening, maybe who lives in Chicago, knows that this is a very evangelical, very powerful, if you will, Bible college, missionary training college. My husband was actually studying to be a missionary pilot which is a whole nother discussion as to what that means. But anyway, so...
Is that someone who drops leaflets from the sky over?
No. He actually wanted to fly planes,
right.
and he wanted to take missionaries to these places
their
like in Africa,
right.
and so they don't take big planes to go there. They would take small planes, and because they would also need to bring supplies with them for the local populace and things like that. And so they also had to be trained as missionaries because I guess depending on the arrangement, you might also be doing some work in the field. Yeah. And so it was one of those kind of a setting. So he was a trained pastor, and we started dating, and we started getting really serious, and we started talking about marriage.
And by the way, just to interrupt,
okay.
I'm just so curious, and it's really not that germane probably to the story, but what does dating relationships look like in that sort of quote unquote orthodox culture?
Right. So I would say it's definitely kind of a cross between what we know as orthodox dating and secular dating. In other words, we did go out. We spent a lot of time together. We did hold hands. There was some, touching, which is not what you find in the Orthodox world.
Right.
But there was not going to be any actual intimacy. That was not allowed. That was not okay. So I would call it kind of halfway, between the two. We dated for 9 months, which is a lot longer than you would find in the Orthodox world, because once we discover that we've got the right person, we make it quick so that there's no temptation to do anything that they shouldn't do. So that's basically it. It was definitely more the secular model than the Orthodox model, but very wholesome as far as the limits that were placed on interactions with each other.
So you were getting serious with this guy, with this pilot, or this emerging pilot.
Emerging pilot, right. It turned out that he washed out of the actual airport flying part of the process. So he was a trained pastor, but he didn't make the cut because they were very, very, if you had 100 students, maybe 10 or 15 made it into the program. So it's not actually a reflection on him other than that he just didn't make it into the program. But he was a pastor, and he was trained, and we were dating, and we were getting serious. And I thought to myself, I've always had this dream. Girls dream about their wedding from the time that they're old enough to know what a wedding is. I had always had this dream that my father would walk me down the aisle when I got married, but I didn't know my dad. And so I said to my mom, would it be okay to write a letter to my dad to invite him to come for a visit? Now, back then, of course, that's before emails and texting and all of that.
And what year are we, just for some context?
1986.
Okay.
I think. Yeah, 85, 86. And so I asked my mom if it was okay to write him a letter, and she said yes. And I wrote a letter to my dad, and I invited him to come visit. Now, remember, we're living in Miami, and he's actually living still in New Jersey.
So you knew where he was?
I knew where he was. Yeah. Not exactly. I knew he was in New Jersey. I didn't know where. He wasn't in Lakewood. And he agreed to come for a visit. So he came down for a couple of weeks to visit with us, and we were getting to know him, and he was getting reacquainted with my mom. And at some point he says to my mom, I think I'm falling back in love with you. Would you remarry me?
Wow.
And my mom said, well, I'm kind of falling back in love with you too, but we have a problem because I'm a born-again Christian and you're a secular Jew, and that's not going to work. And I said, well, wait a minute, not a problem. I'm trained in evangelism, right? I know what to do. So I bought a Bible for my dad, and I started sharing with him the gospel, the Christian story, and I took him to church, and my dad became a Christian too.
Wow, 3 for 3.
Yeah, there you go. So I don't know what it is. I just seem to have this ability. But they say with great power comes great responsibility. So later on in the story, there are definitely some regrets. But so my mom and my dad got remarried after having been divorced for 15 years.
It's an incredible thing. That obviously must mean that it wasn't terribly acrimonious at the earlier point.
I think it definitely was. There was a lot, but they hadn't seen each other for 15 years, and time, it may not heal all things, but it definitely makes you forget the severity. And also they had grown and changed. I mean, 15 years is a long time. They were both very young when they got married, really too young I feel, to have been married. They didn't understand how to have a relationship, how to love people. My dad battled with depression. And so it was just a really difficult early time. And so now, though, they're 15 years older. My mother has been a mother for so many years, for, 17, at that point, 19, almost 19 years. And so she was more mature. My dad had been through therapy and other things, so he was more mature. And so, yeah, it was definitely a different situation. And so they decided to get remarried.
It's incredible. Hey, what's so interesting to me is that you were that interested in having him back in your life.
I was. I think that every kid has a fantasy. We fantasize about the ideal that we see. So you watch TV and you've got all of these married couples. You very rarely see nowadays more so. Yeah, but back in the 80s, the TV was full of it's. I'm not as old as Leave It to Beaver. No, I'm not that old. But you had
Cosby Show. Not
exactly.
To mention where he's gone since
well,
then,
okay, but the show itself really glorified this wonderful marriage, and there were plenty of other shows as well.
Yep.
And so you grow up seeing that and seeing that your family doesn't look like that, and so you fantasize about that. So the truth is that when my dad came into our life, it almost didn't matter what kind of a person he was at that point. I wanted my dad and my mom back together, and so it happened. And
you obviously hadn't felt spurned by him or profoundly hurt by him.
It's interesting. I did, but I guess I buried it. It didn't come out until much later on in my life that I realized, and he had remarried in between. Now, it wasn't a halachic marriage, in case anybody listening is wondering about all of that. But he had helped this woman raise her 2 sons. And I definitely, as an older adult, thinking about it, I hadn't thought about it as a kid. I mean, it upset me that my father didn't care enough to even send birthday cards. And it upset me that there was no communication, but that was the extent that I had thought about it. As an older adult, I really had to deal with the hurt and the pain of, those 2 boys were good enough for him to be a father to, but he didn't father me.
Yeah.
And he didn't love me enough to have me in his life. Of course, I didn't understand all of the complexities of the pain of the divorce and what that would mean as far as his ability to connect to us. Exactly.
Did you ever get to sort of confront that and with him directly? I imagine.
Yeah, later on, he actually passed away about 6 years ago. There was certain levels of discussion, but no, I actually made the conscious decision as I went through my own healing process. I made the conscious decision not to confront him because of the fact that he was, in my opinion, very fragile emotionally. And I didn't want to destroy him. I didn't want to cause him to go back into a very, very painful place. When I was strong enough to deal with it after I got my own healing, I gave forgiveness and I didn't need to rehash it. And I certainly wasn't going to gain anything by making him depressed and miserable over what he had done. And, unless I wanted to extract revenge, what would be the point? And I didn't want to do that. Mm-hmm. And so I talk a lot. As probably later in the podcast, we'll talk a little bit more about where I've shifted in my focus in life. But I do a lot of life coaching. And one of the things that I talk about is the difference between forgiveness and pardon. Mm. And, every fall when we get to the holidays and we talk about forgiveness, or when people listen to personal growth experts who say, you've got to forgive, otherwise it's going to eat you up, it's going to destroy you.
Resentment is a poison that you take and expect others to suffer from.
Exactly. And I feel like we really do ourselves a disservice by using the word forgiveness to mean 2 different things. Mm-hmm. Because I say that pardon is a gift that you give to others and forgiveness is a gift you give to yourself.
Interesting.
So when you forgive somebody, you let go of your right to hold on to the pain that they've caused you, because when you hold on to that pain, of course, you're allowing them to continue to injure you virtually over and over and over again, right? Pardon is when you give up your right, if you will, to extract consequences for the pain that they caused you. A pardon, and we see that in the prayers for the high holidays, when we're asking God to forgive us, we use several different languages, and one of them is slicha, which is pardon, which is wipe clean my offenses so that I don't have to suffer from the consequences of them anymore. I don't have to worry about how that's going to affect my life, both in this world and in the world to come. So anyway, I chose to not only forgive, but also to pardon and just let it move on, so that we could, and my children had a fantastic relationship with my father.
Great gift.
And I don't often share some of the difficulties, and I'm not sharing with the audience all of, obviously, the details of the difficulties in our relationship, because I wanted them to have a wonderful memory of a grandfather that they had a great relationship with.
Yeah, unbiased, without the prejudice of that history.
Yeah, exactly. And so after my parents were remarried, 7 months later, my husband and I got married, and my father did walk me down the aisle. Wow. It was in a church.
Sure.
It was in a church, but
I would have expected that at that point in time.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you were, 19, 20 years old at that time?
I was 19, yeah.
Oh.
And I was actually 1 month short of 19. And so very young. My husband and I today look back and we're like surprised that we managed to stay together, because we were both very young, very stupid,
Sure.
very immature, but we did. We got
Best
married.
time to get married, according to some.
And
the worst.
Right. It has its pros and its cons, because we grew together,
Yep.
which was fabulous. We didn't have any preconceived notions of what it means to live on your own. We didn't have to make that space. I moved from my parents' house to, sharing my life with someone else, and I didn't have to undo having been by myself for a period of time or anything like that.
Yeah.
So there definitely was advantages to that.
They often say that if people realized what getting married meant, they wouldn't do it. That's why it's good to get married young, before you kind of realize.
While you're still stupid.
Obviously that can cut both ways. It can bring its challenges as well, of course. So
sure.
was your plan to go into the ministry as a couple?
Yeah, absolutely. We had planned on doing that. Now, at the time, though, my husband didn't have a church of his own. We were young, and he had tried his hand. He went to a place in Florida called Full Sail Institute. He got trained also in sound engineering, and
cool.
he was intending on like running sound for these big mega churches and stuff like that. And I guess he didn't have as much confidence in his ability to be one of the pastors that's on the stage. He's more of the kind of, caring, teaching kind of guys. But he really loved the sound industry, and so he trained in that. But he searched as well as he could in Tennessee, Nashville, whatever. He couldn't find a job. And so he came back to Miami to be with his family, who was in Miami at the time. And that's kind of how we met. So anyway, he was unemployed, really. I mean, he was working as a administrative position for a government job, and it was like he wasn't happy with it. So he decided to enlist in the United States Air Force. And so when we got married, he was new in the Air Force. We married after boot camp, but while he was still in technical school, and he trained in electronics engineering.
Did he consider again going back into the pilot space at that point?
I think he was afraid to. I think that he kind of got burned, and my husband's he's a very sensitive person, not especially outwardly, but it's easy to kind of get disillusioned when you get rejected by things. And so he felt like, well, at least in the Air Force, he'll get trained in a career. They're not going to kick him out for at least 4 years, so it's guaranteed that he'll have a job. And it's a way to support a family, and that was his biggest concern. He couldn't support a family on a barely above minimum wage government administrative job, and this was going to give him a career that he would be able to support a family with. And so we got married, and he ended up getting stationed in England, which was one of the places we had requested, and so we wanted to, we were young and wanted to explore. Exactly, and he had the options of England and Germany and I think Japan, but we chose England. I always had that curiosity. And so we went there, and we did fall in love with England, interestingly enough. We lived in the countryside, and so it was a much slower paced life. And, it wasn't London. It was rolling hills and sheep that go ba. And so we were there. And while we were there, one day I was praying, because that's what you do. And I had this feeling that God was telling me to light candles on Friday night. So I didn't know where it was coming from, because I certainly didn't have an example of it. My mother didn't light candles on Friday night. My grandmother didn't. As I say, when I tell my story, I'm sure that my great-grandmother must have, but I didn't remember her doing it. But I knew that Jewish women lit candles on Friday night because I had been to the Orthodox day school for 2 years.
Right.
So even though a lot of it didn't stick, I mean, obviously there was a certain level of knowledge that I got. I learned how to read the Hebrew alphabet at least, and I knew a couple of things about being Jewish, not much, but I did know that Jewish women lit candles on Friday night. But I wasn't sure how that would work with being a Christian. I wasn't sure why God would be, because as a Christian, I understood that Judaism was a thing of the past. It was old, and it was replaced by the New Testament and the new story and Jesus and all of that. And so I went to my husband and I said to him, I have this really strong feeling that God wants me to light candles on Friday night. What do you think I should do? And he said to me, well, if you believe that this is what God wants you to do in your service to him, then go ahead.
Was this on a Friday, by the way, when you got this vision?
I don't know. I think it was over a course of several days or a week. I'm a very deep thinker. I weigh things. And so, and then I went to my husband. I said, it's not going away, this feeling. And I really feel like I should be doing this. And so I remembered that I had inherited my great-grandmother's candlesticks. So I went to the buffet and I pulled out the candlesticks. And next to the candlesticks was a Maxwell House Passover Haggadah. So, Haggadah is the book that we use for the Passover Seder. And I pulled it out. And now, why did I have this Maxwell House Passover Haggadah? Because even though my family was secular, we did do one thing Jewish each year, and that was we had our own Passover, I say Seder in quotes. It wasn't what most Orthodox Jews would recognize as a Seder.
A family gathering.
Right, exactly. We got together, we came over. My great-grandmother would say, good yontif, which, that's what Bubby said. I didn't know what it meant, but that's what she said. And we'd come in, and my grandfather would pull out this stack of Maxwell House Passover Haggadahs that he had collected over the years. And he would say, something like, everybody turn to page 13. And we would open it, and he would read a paragraph or two. We would sing the chorus to Dayenu, and then we would eat. Sure. We did have matzah because it was Passover, but we also ate a lot of things that most of us wouldn't recognize as kosher for Passover now, but I had this fond family memory of doing this. And so I asked my grandmother when I got married if I could have one of these Haggadahs. And she said, yes, of course. And so what does this have to do with lighting candles on Friday night? Well, the addition of the Haggadah, by the way, not all later editions have this, which is why I say it that way. But the addition of the Haggadah that I had the blessing for lighting candles in the front page because, of course, we light candles at the beginning of every Jewish holiday. And then the last line said on Friday night, say this, because sometimes Passover begins on Friday night. And so I always say, thank God for Maxwell House. Not only did it have it in the English and the Hebrew, but it had transliteration.
Yes.
So I was able to read the Hebrew blessing in English letters, and I began lighting candles on Friday night. Meanwhile, I'm going to church on Sunday.
So you did this actually not just once, but as a routine.
Yeah, every week.
Wow.
I started doing it every week. And, I'm still going to church on Sunday. It didn't change any of my beliefs, but I just really felt that this was what God was telling me to do, so I started doing it.
Sure. And what did that do for you?
At that point, not much. But as you'll see, it became a part of a bigger picture. So one day, I don't know how long later, really, my husband comes running down the stairs, and he says, Penina, I was reading in the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is what non-Jews call our Jewish Bible, our Tanakh. They've retranslated, I would say mistranslated, some of the passages so that it says what they need it to say, and they've rearranged the order of the books, but basically, it's our Tanakh. He says, I was reading in the Old Testament and I came across a verse that says that there are certain things that God told the Jewish people to do forever. He said, and if forever really means forever, and I'm to be right before God, then my Jewish wife and my Jewish children need to do these things.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So he recognized you as Jewish.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I say he was more aware of my Jewishness than I was. Not that I didn't know I was Jewish, but awareness is another level. And I really do believe it was Hashem, it was God. But, I said, so the thing is that I am a person who seeks truth. It always has been. And my husband also. And in fact, even in our Christian expression, as we were on our journey, when we discovered certain things that most Christians do that are traditions that have nothing to do with Christianity but came out of paganism through Catholicism, we abandoned those. Like, even though we celebrated Christmas, we abandoned a Christmas tree very early on and things like that. So here's my husband telling me that there's something that God wants the Jewish people to continue doing. And so I said, okay, go ahead, shoot. He said, well, it says in the Old Testament that God told the Jewish people not to eat pork or shellfish. And I was like, you mean no more ham and cheese sandwiches? And he was like, yeah. And I think, well, I have to think about this for a minute. But again, if this is what God wants me to do and I want to serve him in truth, then I'm going to do it. And so I agreed, and I decided to stop eating pork and shellfish. So here I am, I'm lighting candles on Friday night. I'm no longer eating pork or shellfish, and I'm still going to church on Sunday.
Sure.
So a little while later, I'm reading in the Christian part of the Christian Bible, the New Testament, and I come across a verse that's talking about head coverings. I was kind of like a little surprised, even though I had read my Bible, I don't know how many times. I guess I just really hadn't stopped and noticed this passage. And but it was confusing, because I wasn't sure whether it was saying that men were supposed to cover their head and women weren't, or women were supposed to cover their heads and men weren't. And so we invited the pastor of our church, which was not my husband at the time. He was still in the Air Force. We invited the pastor of our church to come to explain, because he was a Greek scholar, and Greek is the language that the New Testament is written in. And he comes in and he says, well, this is kind of a complicated passage. And I said, yeah, I know, that's why I invited you here. He said, no, really, even in the Greek, it's hard to tell which word is modifying which word. And so I said, okay, well, what do you think it means? And he said to me, well, I think it means that married women are supposed to cover their head when they pray. He said, I can't teach that now, because women nowadays don't want to hear it, but that's what I believe that this is saying. Now, as a person who was seeking truth, women nowadays not wanting to do something was not enough of a reason for me to not do something if I believed it was the right thing to do. Yeah. And so I decided to start covering my head.
And just to double click on that for a minute, because I think it's such an extraordinary posture that's very rare, as you note. This sort of fanatical obsession with truth.
Right.
Many people would argue that, at least today, we live in kind of like a post-truth era. Others have pushed back on that. But regardless, I think it is fairly obvious that many people are not seeking sort of a pure intellectual truth in life.
Right.
There's a big, a large hybrid or sort of mixture of emotional and personal bias and whatever it is. And again, not to judge, we are composite beings.
Yes, absolutely.
Intellectual, but you seem to have this sort of this bent towards finding the pristine, idealized truth and then following that at all costs.
Right.
Where do you think that came from?
Oh, that's a really good question. I just do believe that it's something that God put in me, that's part of my makeup. I mean, I'm definitely an emotional person. There's no question. And I definitely think that, especially religions, faith systems need to take into account the emotional part of it, because most people are, like you said, composite beings, and emotion does figure into it very greatly. And as a person who worked later in trying to help Jews come back to Judaism, I realized that there are some times when emotion is everything, and you have to cater to that, and you have to recognize that. And there are so many people that go into Christianity specifically because of the emotional pull, because Christianity, because they don't have the same restrictions we do as far as worship, so they have a lot of music. It's very emotional. It feeds that, and it feels good. And people need to feel good. I try to explain to my friends who have come out of Christianity and go into Judaism, they're like, that's the one thing I really miss. I really miss the worship music and the singing and the stuff like that. And the Shabbat singing just, in the shul, in the synagogue, just isn't quite the same. And I try to explain to them, go get yourself invited to a Jewish wedding, because that's where we experience the kind of joy that Christians experience on Sunday morning. And there's a really good logical reason for that. In the Christian world, the church is the center of Christian life. That's where everything happens. That's where everybody comes together. And in Judaism, the synagogue, we make the mistake of thinking a synagogue is a Jewish church, and it's not. The synagogue is only a facility that facilitates our doing our duty, right? Because our prayers, the formalized prayers, they're not as much about the relationship with God as they are a replacement for the sacrifices for the nation that were done in the temple, back when we had a temple. And so now that's why we have the morning service, the afternoon service, and the evening service. They replaced those, and that's part of our national identity. But we have, and some sects, of course, are better at this than others, but in the Hasidic world, we have this idea of hitbodedut, of personal prayer, of pouring out your heart to God. And so for Judaism, the center of Judaism isn't the building, it's the home. And so where we celebrate Judaism at its core is when we're making a new Jewish home. There's a new Jewish home being established at a wedding, and so that's where you have this incredible outpouring of joy and celebration. And so I try to encourage people who are struggling with this transition from this incredible unrestrained joy that they experienced in worshiping God in the church, and they don't necessarily find, although definitely it's more so in some groups than in others.
As in get them invited to a Karl Bach.
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
Exactly. And my community in Israel, our Friday night prayer service is a Karl Bach style service, and it's incredibly full of joy. But it's at the Jewish wedding that you really experience this unbridled joy, and that's because we've made another Jewish home, and we've built onto the community, which is where the center of Jewish life is. And I think that that's like a really important
That's a really interesting reframe.
point.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were, back to the story, you were deciding to cover your hair. Why not?
Right. Yeah, and so it's funny because I tell the story about how, I started with a hat, but I'm very distractible, and I found that I wanted to talk to God, because that's what prayer is, talking to God. And I found that I did it more than once a day, and so I frequently had to go find my hat, and it was rather inconvenient for the moment. And so I decided that what I would do is I would buy a scarf. And I didn't have any example of any women that covered their heads. The best I could do was the Amish women with their little bonnets on their head, Otherwise, I had no example. So I said, okay, well, I'll go get a scarf and I'll wear it around my shoulders, around my neck. And when I want to pray, I'll put it on my head. And when I'm not praying, I'll have it on my neck. And that way I won't lose it. Won't misplace it, and kind of get out of the moment when I want to talk to God. But I discovered that I talk to God throughout the course of the day, and so the scarf is on and off. Exactly, on and off and on and off.
Scarf off.
Exactly, and so I just decided, you know what, forget this. I'm just going to cover my head all the time, and so I started wearing a scarf all the time.
Oh my.
So now here I am. I'm lighting candles on Friday night. I'm not eating pork or shellfish. I'm covering my head all the time, and something began to happen inside of me. At the time, of course, I didn't know what it was, but now I call it my spiritual identity crisis. I believe that once, that my Jewish soul began to become at odds with my Christian faith. So I'm a firm believer that once a Jew takes on a mitzvah, any mitzvah, just one of the commandments, and begins to do them, even if they don't realize that that's what they're doing, they open a conduit between their soul and God, and a communication begins to happen. And so I had this restlessness going on inside of me. Well, my mom and my dad came to visit us in England. I was about to have my second child, and last I had left them, they were attending a nice little Assembly of God church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'm helping my mom unpack her suitcases, and one of the suitcases is full of Judaica items. Shofars, tzitzit, talits, kippot, yarmulkes, prayer books, And I turned to my mom and I'm like, Mom, what's with all this Jewish stuff? And she says, well, while we were in Pittsburgh, we discovered a group of Jewish people who were born Jewish, who had found a way, who had become Christians and had found a way to synthesize their Jewish heritage with their Christian faith. And they called themselves Messianic Jews. Now, I had never heard of this term Messianic Jews before, but I had heard of Jews for Jesus. And I really thought that maybe this was the answer to what was going on inside of me. And so a year later, when we came back to the United States, we sought out a Messianic congregation. We started going. We actually got ourselves stationed in the Washington, D.C. area because that's where my parents were living.
Where were you living exactly?
Bowie.
In Bowie, okay.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah. We lived in Maryland a total of 16 years.
Oh, wow.
Laurel and Bowie were our primary first places.
Okay.
So Laurel's not far from
Not far from
Silver Spring.
College Park where I work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right
exactly.
on Route 1.
Yeah, exactly. Because my husband was stationed with the NSA and stuff like that. So I'm not allowed to say that. I was going to say, I'm not allowed to say that, right? So anyway, so we started attending a Messianic congregation, actually, that was in Annapolis, which is a long drive. Eventually we switched to Washington, D.C., but it was still every Messianic congregation that was in driving distance of us was an hour's drive away. And so one day my parents approached my husband and I, and they said, the closest congregation is an hour away, and Paul's a trained pastor, and Penina at this point, I mean, we had been involved in lay leadership now, for I don't know how many years, but ever since we got married, and so I sang and I played the guitar, and I had led women's prayer groups and Bible studies and stuff like that. So my dad's like, Paul is a pastor, and you've got also these leadership skills, and Mom and I also have leadership skills, but we're also very administrative, and I think that the four of us together would make a great team. Why don't we start our own Messianic congregation? And so my husband and I prayed about it, and we decided that that was what God wanted us to do, and we started our own Messianic congregation in Bowie, actually. And at the time, though, I thought to myself, if we're going to be doing something Jewish, because it's called Messianic Judaism, maybe we ought to know a little something about Judaism, don't you think?
Sure.
And so I went to the Jewish bookstore looking for a book on Judaism. Well, I discovered, of course, that there's lots of books on Judaism in the Jewish bookstore.
What bookstore did you go to, by the way?
Rabbi Lisbon's.
Was it Libson's?
Lisbon's.
Lisbon's, Judaica.
Yeah, exactly, which I don't believe exists anymore. He
Yeah.
sold it many years ago now. But at the time, it was user-friendly. It was accessible.
Yeah.
And so I discovered a book that had an intriguing title, at least to me. The book was called How to Run a Traditional Jewish Household. It was written by a very modern Orthodox woman named Blue Greenberg.
Sure.
And as I read the book, I discovered that she didn't call herself Orthodox. She liked using the term Torah observant. And I thought to myself, I like the sound of that, Torah observant. Maybe that's what we need to be. Maybe we need to be Torah observant Messianic Jews.
Interesting.
Yeah. And
Because she founded, I believe, JOFA, which is
right,
Jewish
exactly.
Orthodox Feminist Alliance, but okay.
Right. Yeah. And I'm very careful to say that, she inspired me. That doesn't necessarily mean that I align myself with all of her beliefs and stuff, but that her book was extremely instrumental in my journey.
Yeah.
And so I went back to the Jewish bookstore to find more books on Judaism. The next book that I bought was the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is the abridged code of Jewish law. I bought it in English. I read it through several times. It definitely made me more confused than anything else, but inspired me to go back and buy the Art Scroll tome on keeping kosher. I bought books on keeping Shabbat. I bought books on the laws of family purity. And I like to say everything you can learn about being an Orthodox Jew from a book, I did. Of course, you can't learn everything there is to learn about being an Orthodox Jew from a book, but everything you can, I did, and began to make changes in our life. And I started to dress more modestly. My husband and my sons were now wearing a kippah and tzitzit. And if you had run into us on the street, you would have thought we were an Orthodox Jewish couple, just like any Orthodox Jewish couple in Rockville or Baltimore or Jerusalem. You would not have known that we also believed in Jesus.
I'm very curious because I think there's a perception that there's something very duplicitous, manipulative about the Messianic Jewish, whatever you want to call it, in Jews for Jesus that movement.
Absolutely.
And that they're people kind of, sheep's in lamb's clothing or whatever the...
wolf's clothing.
Well, sheep in wolf's clothing.
Yeah.
And kind of people that are intentionally and deceptively sort of dressing themselves up in order to attract Jews into their congregations and then proselytize about Jesus.
Sure, no
But it sounds
question.
like you were not doing that.
Okay, so we definitely we even have Jews for Judaism has copies of letters from some of the people that started the more modern incarnation of Messianic Judaism, and their goal was to create a church that looked like a synagogue that would attract Jews, and for the sole purpose of converting them to Christianity, no question. But just like a lot of other things, once you get beyond one generation, you start to have people who that's their identity. And it's not about being deceptive, even though it is in and of itself deceptive.
Sure, that's not the intentions of the individuals.
Correct. And yes, because this great commandment is to proselytize and to get people to believe. And you have to understand, too, not that I want to whitewash the dangers or anything, but they're coming from actually a very altruistic place. And that is this idea that if you don't believe in their Messiah, that you're going to burn in hell
Eternal
forever.
damnation.
Exactly. Yeah. And they're actually, for the most part, very good, caring people who care about other people's souls. And they don't want to see that happen. And so they want to share this good news with you so that you will embrace the Messiah and you will. I mean, there's lots and lots and lots of errors in the whole trail, the whole worldview that's involved in Christianity. And I actually wrote a book. I wrote a counter-missionary book in addition to my own story because I was giving a course in this in Jerusalem and I wanted to make it available to people more widely. But I think now that we're looking at, I think, like the third generation, if you will, of Messianic Jews in the modern incarnation of Messianic Judaism, I think you see more and more a lot of this. I was raised with this belief, and just as we're willing to give regular Christians kind of the benefit of the doubt that even though sharing their faith is part of their faith, so yes, we do have to be on the lookout for them seeing us as prey, if you will, at the same time, we do see them as simply good people who love God and misunderstand how God relates to the world and to people, and we give them a lot of latitude. But because Messianic Judaism, or Jews for Jesus, whichever terms you want to use, are definitely encroaching on the Jewish space, if you will, in their look and their feel and everything, it's definitely a more complicated situation. But for me, becoming Messianic was about my Jewish soul and my Jewish identity, and trying to make a what's the term I'm looking for? Trying to
harmonize.
Yeah, that's a good term. Create harmony between my beliefs and who I knew myself to be, born a Jewish person.
It's interesting is that on two fronts. Number one, my impression of sort of mainline Christian groups has been that there was an intentional sense that the old covenant had been replaced.
Absolutely.
With theology, and there was an abrogation. I'm no scholar, but I understood that. The whole idea was that the Council of Nicaea, and that they replaced. There was no longer a need for active mitzvot and things like that.
Right.
So, although of course these things are written in the Old Testament in the Jewish Bible, they were no longer necessary to observe. So why did you feel that you needed to observe them? A, and B, did your husband feel that pull as well, or he felt that was only for you as a quote-unquote Jew?
That's a really good question. So the thing is that we looked from this new perspective, if you will, back into the New Testament and said, wait a minute, Jesus was a Jew. He kept the mitzvot, right? And if he is the promised Messiah who fulfilled the prophecies in the Jewish Bible, which he didn't, by the way, but, I just have to add that. But if he did, then it can't be wrong for us to be believers in him as our faith and do these things. And if anything, it's probably the more authentic way of being a Christian. Of course, we know from history that the earliest Christians were Jews. Sure. It didn't take very long for it to become primarily a non-Jewish religion. It was very, by 30, 40, years later, it was primarily a non-Jewish faith, especially after
Roman Empire and adapted it.
Even before that, Jesus said some things in the New Testament that are understood to mean that he was saying that he was going to come back and fulfill all of those things that he hadn't done, because of course everybody looked around and said, wait a minute, Messiah is supposed to bring world peace, and he hasn't brought world peace. And he said, I'm going to come back before this generation tastes of death. So everybody understood that certainly within 100 years he was going to come back. So it wasn't when he didn't come back. And the Jews are like, no, okay, we understand we have this idea of potential messiahs. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. Obviously, there's some things documented in the New Testament that the Jewish establishment was not happy with him. How much of it is true or not, we're not 100% sure. But the Jews say, okay, so we'll wait and we'll see what happens. Well, after 50 years of not coming back, 60 years of not coming back, all of the original believers are now dying or dead. And he hasn't come back. And so, like many of the messianic movements throughout our history, we said, okay, he wasn't the Messiah. Maybe he was a potential Messiah for our generation, maybe not. But he definitely was not the Messiah. He didn't come back. He didn't do what he was going to say. He didn't bring world peace. He didn't reestablish, worship in the temple and all of that. And at that point, the temple had been destroyed or was in the process of being destroyed, depending on which part you're looking at. And so then what the non-Jews said, well, if he's not the Messiah, then we're kind of we're messed up here, because the early church was preaching this idea that if you believed in the Jewish Messiah, in some way you were becoming part of the Jewish people without having to convert, but that you were now part of the chosen people, part in God's economy, so to speak. And so when he didn't come back, and they were like, we're screwed. I mean, what are we going to do, right? They said, okay, so we must have misunderstood. He's not the Messiah, Moshiach, who is going to be a physical king, who's going to bring a physical rescue. The word Yeshua in Hebrew, right? That doesn't mean spiritual rescue. It means physical rescue. And it only ever means physical rescue, which I think is an important people to understand, because a lot of the Messianic Jews will say, well, his name isn't Jesus. His Hebrew name was Yeshua, and that's what he did. He brought a spiritual salvation. But the word Yeshua in Hebrew doesn't mean spiritual salvation. It means a physical rescue. So when he didn't come back, they said, okay, well, maybe he was the Moshiach. He was a savior, a spiritual thing. It wasn't a physical thing. And when he comes back, he'll take care of all of the physical prophecies. They had to change the idea from this physical redeemer to a spiritual redeemer, because clearly he didn't come back and bring this, world of peace and everything that the Jewish scriptures said that the Messiah was going to do. So anyway, that's kind of where the transition went from. But and so as it became a non-Jewish faith, really, I think that the church, especially when you say, how the Roman Empire kind of institutionalized it as the state religion, and of course Constantine recognized the power of religion and used it as a tool to use control over people, and of course we know where that went, the Spanish Inquisition eventually and all of that. But
so you kind of felt that you were returning to the original intent,
exactly,
and that the abdication of mitzvot was kind of a corruption of sorts at some point. Exactly.
That I felt that the Jewish people were still obligated to do the things that God had done. And the way that I dealt with the verses that said that you're no longer under the law was that what that meant was, while we still were given this framework of behavior, if you will, in our relationship with God, there were no longer the consequences for sin, because those were taken by belief in Jesus. So that was it. It was not that we no longer, just like Christians who believe that Jesus has saved them don't believe that it's okay to go and murder, right? They believe that they still have a code of behavior that God expects from them. And so we just expanded that from the 10 Commandments to the 613. That we as Jews, that I as a Jew, still had this obligation. And my husband also agreed with this, and like many non-Jews who are involved in the Messianic movement, felt that this Messianic way of being was more authentic, because that's how Jesus lived. And so they feel like they're living like Jesus
What would
lived.
Jesus do?
Exactly. That is exactly what it is.
Okay, beautiful. So you're in this, fast forwarding a little bit. So you're in this messianic space. You're starting this church.
Right.
What was it called, by the way?
What was it called? Knesset Hashuvim.
The Congregation of Return.
Exactly.
Returners. Interesting.
Exactly. And
Okay.
so we began to, teach this idea of Torah observance as believers in, we called him Yeshua, but Jesus, And we did this with my parents jointly for about 3 years.
And did you get a following?
Yeah. We had, not huge, we had about 40, 50 people at one point. And then we decided, my husband and I, we were kind of getting a little burnt out because, it's tense working that closely with your parents.
Yeah.
I'm sure they were equally burned out. And we decided that we valued our relationship with my parents more than our position as leaders. And so we decided to leave. And my parents continued to run the congregation for several more years. Meanwhile, we had to figure out what to do. And I kind of skip. In my book, I give a little more details because we did a little stint in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but we eventually landed in the Messianic congregation in Northern Virginia. And while we were there, though, there was an event at the Messianic congregation in Baltimore, which is where my sister and her family were attending. And after the event, there was food because, let's face it, you have Jews, you have an event, you have food. That's right. It doesn't matter that they believe in Jesus, Jews plus event equals food. So we're standing around afterwards, and there's this really nice blonde-haired lady who's trying to convince me that the food is kosher because she can tell by looking at me that might be something that's important to me. And while she's talking to me about the kosher food, she stops mid-sentence. And she says to me, how would you like to buy a nice big 5-bedroom house in Upper Park Heights in Maryland? She says, in fact, I believe that God wants you to buy this house. Now, my audience, if I have a primarily Jewish audience when I'm telling my story, they always burst out laughing when I say that because it sounds so odd. But in the Christian world, it's actually not that odd. And so I was used to people talking like that, but I did think that maybe she was a few French fries short of a Happy Meal. And I'm not one for confrontation. I'm actually not very good at confrontation at all. In fact, last night I had a confrontation with a Christian woman who was in the audience, which is like, oh my God, how do I deal with this? So anyway, so I decided how I would deal with it was I would tell her I needed to talk to my husband because, like, marriage 101, blame it on your husband.
Sure.
Works. And I knew what he was going to say. He worked in Northern Virginia. We were attending a congregation in Northern Virginia. We were eventually going to move there. Baltimore was nowhere on our radar screen. And, what? Are you crazy? So I go over to my husband and I tell him about what this woman has said. And she even offered to hold the mortgage for us so we wouldn't have to qualify, And
This was her house? Or
this was her house. She owned
she was
this
trying
house.
to move.
She wanted to sell the house. And so instead of reading the script and telling me I was crazy and we weren't going there, my husband says, well, we can take a look at it. So as I say, I had it on good authority. That was the first and last time I was ever speechless. But we made an appointment and we went to go see the house. And long story short, we drove up to the house and I got this feeling like I was home. We went in, we fell in love with the house. It was 3 times the size of the house we were living in, and I was homeschooling 4 children in my dining room. My walls are closing in on me. So, of course, I fell in love with the house, and it had a lot of character, too. And
what street was it on?
it was on West Strathmore Street,
Sure.
Across from what is now Benos and used to be Rambam.
Sure.
So if any of your listeners are from Baltimore, yes, we were the missionaries in the missionary house on Strathmore. We made arrangements. Well, so what happened was actually we went to our Messianic congregation and we asked them to pray concerning whether or not it was God's will for us to buy this house because, we didn't know what to do. And so they even held a special prayer meeting for the purpose. And wouldn't you know it, all 250 members of the congregation unanimously agreed, which right there is like it's a miracle right there.
That's a tell.
Yeah, that it was God's will for us to buy this house. Why? Because who better to convert Orthodox Jews to Messianic Judaism than Messianic Jews who look and act like Orthodox Jews, right? And so we made arrangements and we moved in. Well, we were kind of shocked. We thought, you move into a suburbs, into a home, that the neighbors are all going to stop by, say hello, introduce
Drop off a pie,
themselves.
yeah.
Right, exactly. A cake. In Israel, when they did that for us when we moved into one of our neighborhoods, they actually brought us wine, which is, hey, I mean, that's a good reason to make aliyah, right? But no, so we were kind of a little surprised by the fact that nobody was very friendly. And it wasn't that they meant to be rude, it was that they didn't know what to do with us. Because what happened was, I didn't know this until many years later actually, that when the woman had bought the house 3 years earlier, and she wasn't Jewish, we knew that. When she had bought the house 3 years earlier, she took it upon herself to go knocking door to door to all of her Jewish neighbors, and they were all Jewish, to make it. West Strathmore is a very Jewish street, to make sure that they all knew that they were hopelessly lost and going to burn in hell forever because they didn't believe in Jesus. So you can imagine how the neighbors felt about her, and how when she told them that she had sold the house, how ecstatic they were. Until she told them that a nice Messianic family was moving in next door.
So people knew who you were.
Yeah, people on that street definitely knew that this Messianic family was moving in. And Orthodox Jews in the Western world, we know how to live next door to non-Jews. That's not a problem. But how do you live next door to Jews whose sole purpose, pun intended, is to convert you and your family to some form of Christianity? And so they didn't know what to do with us. And we moved in, and suddenly, I don't know why we didn't think about this before, but suddenly my husband and I realized that we had a problem. Because if we drove on Shabbat, nobody in the community was going to listen to a word we had to say. And yet, that was the whole purpose for moving into the community, right? Was to spread our message. And the Messianic congregation in Baltimore was not in walking distance of that home. So we prayed about it, and what we decided to do was on Shabbat, we would drive to one of the more than a dozen, walk to one of the more than a dozen Orthodox synagogues in walking distance of the house. And in the middle of the week, we would drive to the Messianic congregation to get our fill of Yeshua, of Jesus. So which congregation do we go to? Well, it turns out that Rabbi Lisbon was, and still is, a congregational rabbi in Baltimore. So that's how we decided where we would go.
Huh.
And so we looked it up on the internet. Internet was actually still relatively new at that time, but his information was there. And we decided that that's where we would go on Shabbat. So fortunately for us, it was about a quarter of a mile walk from our house. And so they didn't know who we were. And we went to the congregation, and the people there were amazing, very warm, very welcoming. They helped me to follow along in the reading, in the Torah reading, in the prayers. Just lovely, lovely people. And on the other side of the mechitza, the divider between the men's and the women's section, what happens when a new guy is invited, shows up in town? They call him up to the Torah, right? They give him an aliyah to the Torah. So here's my husband. He's wearing a talit and a kippah. He's got a siddur. He looks like he's praying. He's got 3 boys with him who are also wearing kippot and tzitzit. And so they give him an aliyah. They offer him an aliyah to the Torah. And my husband says, well, I'm not Jewish. Now, that's an interesting point, and I make it a very big point when I give my talks, because it's important for the Jewish world to understand that in Messianic congregations around the world, there are a lot of non-Jews. In fact, there are more non-Jews in Messianic congregations than there are Jews. And that's okay. They can attend whatever kind of church they want to go to. But they're learning not only how to act and look like Orthodox Jews, but they learn how to make the blessings on being called to the Torah. Some of them even learn how to pray, read from the Torah. And then they'll visit an Orthodox synagogue, be counted in a minyan, be given an aliyah, and instead of saying, I'm not Jewish, they make up a fake Hebrew name.
Right.
And they're creating a deception. They're not being honest. And I say it's a crime against the Jewish people. Okay, that's a little harsh, but still, it's not right. It's not honest.
But your husband didn't do that?
No, my husband is a man of tremendous integrity, and he said, I'm not Jewish.
So what was the reaction there?
So I'm not 100% sure in the moment. They were probably, the congregation was probably used to getting some visitors that weren't Jewish or whatever.
Prospective converts or something like that.
Right, exactly. And so, I'm sure they were just like, okay. So they knew my husband wasn't Jewish, and they knew that I was, and so therefore the children were as well. We went there for a few weeks, or a couple weeks anyway, and my husband, who is this man of tremendous integrity, says to me, we need to tell the rabbi what we believe. because at some point it's going to come out, obviously, and we don't want him to feel like we've been lying to him. We don't want him to feel betrayed, that we've been deceptive. And I thought about it and I said, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't see that ending well. But he insisted, and so I relented, and we invited the rabbi to come talk to us. And, the rabbi, of course, thought that we were coming to knowing that my husband wasn't Jewish and I was, right?
Talking about conversion.
Exactly. And so he comes in and my husband starts telling him what he believes. And after a minute or two, he stops him and he says, well, you don't believe that anymore, do you? To which my husband says, yeah, I do. So in the moment that it took for shock to register on the rabbi's face, I began to see my world implode, because we had just moved into this very expensive house. We couldn't turn around and sell it. I was homeschooling my children. They were starting to make friends in the community. If they kicked us out of the synagogue, and, who were my kids going to play with? And maybe they were going to take our pictures and put them on posters and post them on lampposts, warning missionaries, stay away. Maybe my kids were going to get beat up. I didn't know what was going to happen. And so I started to cry. So the rabbi turned to me and he said, well, what do you believe? Really, really wise man, picked up on this moment of emotionality. And at this point in my story, I had been a Christian for 17 years. I had been responsible for bringing hundreds, if not thousands, of people to Christianity. I knew what I believed. That was not a question. But in that moment of emotionality, I just kind of went, Rabbi, I don't know what I believe. And I said, please, please don't kick us out of the shul. Don't kick us out of the synagogue. Well, the rabbi was silent for a while. I wasn't sure if he was ever going to say anything again. But when he spoke, he said to me the most important words that anyone has ever said on my Jewish journey. He said to me, you are a Jew no matter what you believe, even though what you believe is not Judaism. He said, let me be clear. It's not Judaism. It's not kosher. It's not okay. But you're a Jewish woman who is responsible before God to fulfill the mitzvot, the commandments that God gave the Jewish people. He said, therefore, I'm going to allow you and your children to continue to come to the synagogue. He said, I'm not ready for your husband to come, because, of course, he didn't know what to do with him. He said, but there's one caveat. I want you to talk to a guy from an organization called Jews for Judaism. And at that time, there was...
Powers,
yes,
or?
exactly,
Yeah.
Mark Powers. Eventually, it was run by Scott
Ruth
Hillman. Right, and then Ruth Guggenheim, exactly. And Ruthie was there for the whole, she was with Mark and she was with Scott and by herself, of course. But so I didn't know, I'd never heard of Jews for Judaism, but I'm not stupid. Jews for Jesus, Jews for Judaism. They probably don't like people like me very much. But what am I going to do? So I kind of agreed with the idea that I was just going to conveniently forget about it, and hopefully he would conveniently forget about it, and we would just be able to continue with the status quo. But he didn't. He kept calling me and saying, Penina, have you called Mark? Have you called Mark? Have you made an appointment? Eventually, the tone changed. And he made it kind of clear that if I didn't call this guy...
Ultimatum.
Right. Well, he didn't do it outright, but I'm good at reading between the lines. Exactly. That something was going to change. And so I called Mark. I bit the bullet. He came over. He walks into our house and he says, so let's talk about why you think that Jesus is the Messiah. I thought to myself, yeah, you start every conversation with that.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah, exactly. But he came in and he sat down, and my husband decided to do the talking, and I was perfectly happy to let him do the talking. And he throws out a verse, and Mark says, he turns to me, and he says, well, at first he says, let's take a look at that. So he opens the Bible to the book of Yeshayahu, sure. Isaiah, where this verse comes
Suffering
from.
servant? Or whatever?
No, it was the virgin birth, actually.
Okay.
And he says, now, Penina, you've read this verse in its context before, right? And I said, of course. I read my Bible every year from cover to cover. And in fact, there's a lot of people who don't realize that is evangelical Christians. That is their goal, to read their Bible every year. We do a Siyum Hashas, right?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. 7 years to go through the... And I actually participate now in a Nach Yomi, going through the writings in the prophets. I do it not in 1 year, I do it in 2 years, so I'm only reading one chapter a day.
Yeah.
But, but the goal of evangelical Christians is to read through their Bible every year, and 2/3 of their Bible is basically ours. It's again, mistranslated and the order of the books is changed, but the essence of it is still our Tanakh. And so, in fact, there are a lot of people who would say that they know our Bible better than we do. And I give all of my audiences a challenge that if you're a Jewish person and you've never read the Tanakh, all of it, not just the Parsha, to make up your mind, you owe it to yourself as a Jew to know what's inside. And especially, a lot of the frum men, the religious Orthodox men who study the Gemara, the Gemara is pretty clear that before you study Gemara, you have to study Mishnah. And before you study Mishnah, you need to study the Tanakh. If you've never read the Tanakh, all of it, and you can read it and I believe in English, just to be familiar with it. So you need to do it from a Jewish translation.
Sure.
And even though I don't actually like the ArtScroll translation for most purposes, for this purpose it's perfect because we have a belief that if you read just the plain text by itself with no commentary, it's easy to misunderstand certain things and come up with actually false beliefs. And so the ArtScroll Tanakh actually takes into account the Midrash and our tradition so that you don't make those mistakes when you're reading it. But it's actually a real shame that Jews don't read their own Bible. And so that's part of my agenda. And I got it from the rabbis that run Jews for Judaism, so I'm not alone in promoting this. But anyway, so back to the story. So he says, you read this, you've read this in its context before. And I said, of course, I read my Bible every year. And he said, well, but when you read it, you see Jesus on every page, right? And I said, of course. Who else could it be about? And he said, well, I want you to do me a favor just this once. I want you to read through this chapter with me without having the bias that it must be talking about Jesus. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the people to whom Isaiah was writing, which was 700 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, 700 years before Jesus ever walked this earth. He said, would you be willing to do that for me? And I said, yeah, I would. And so for the first time in 17 years, I read through this passage in Isaiah without the preconceived notion that it was talking about Jesus. And of course, I discovered that it wasn't talking about Jesus. It's not even a messianic passage, which is really interesting because we do have some messianic passages, like you mentioned, the suffering servant, which do pose more of an issue for us. We have to dig deeper to understand what they're saying because they are messianic. So then the question is, did he fulfill it or didn't he? But Isaiah chapter 7 isn't even a messianic passage, and we know how it was fulfilled. And in chapter 8, the prophet Isaiah talks about who this child that will be born to the young woman is. And anyway, so I read through this passage and I realized it wasn't messianic. And he showed me how that particular verse has to be mistranslated in order for it to say what they claim it says.
Nara, right? It's translating as virgin instead of young woman.
Right. Well, right, exactly. It's not Nara. It's, I'm drawing a blank at the moment. It's, instead of Betula, it is
Alma.
Alma, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so let's start that again. Not Na'ara, it's Alma, which just means youth. It doesn't, right? It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not a person has been intimate with another person, and that's a whole nother lesson about male and female anatomy and the choice of the words. And the prophet Isaiah uses the word Betula, virgin, in other verses in chapters preceding this. So if that's what he really meant, right, that's what he would have used, but he didn't, because that's not the point. And he says who this woman was in the next chapter. So anyway, so we only touched on one other corollary issue, and Mark left. I don't even know if he was, I don't think he was with us as long as this interview is taking, but he left me with a lot to chew on, because if there's one core belief that I had believed all the last 17 years was based on a lie, what else did I believe was based on a lie? And I'll make a long story short. I just went back and I visited his office every other day, asking him, what about this verse? What about this verse? And he said, let's take a look at it. And I didn't take his word for it. I went back to Jews for Jesus. I went back to my pastors. I went back to my friends. I did my own research. And unfortunately, what I found was that, we have this verse in the book of Mishlei, which is Proverbs, that says the first person to make a case seems right until another comes along and argues against it. And I discovered that Christianity was banking on the fact, in quotes, fact, that Judaism doesn't have an answer. Because when you really dig down deep, the only thing that we were left with, I was like, okay, Judaism says this, Christianity says this, what's the correct interpretation of this verse? That it really always boiled down to, we know what it looks like, but we know he's the Messiah in our heart. We know he's the Messiah. And for somebody who was seeking truth, that emotional connection was not enough. Yes, I believed in him. Yes, I had had miracles happen in my life in that context. But I wanted the truth. If you're claiming that he's the Messiah, there has to be proof. And you're claiming that he fulfilled 300 of the prophecies or more than 300 prophecies that were given for the Messiah in the Tanakh. And the truth is that pretty much all of them aren't even prophecies. And the ones that are prophecies, he didn't fulfill. And so, long story short, I obviously abandoned, one by one, the bricks of my faith were being pulled out and the entire structure had to collapse. And then I was faced with the daunting task, of course, of figuring out what I did believe. Did I still believe in God? Did I still believe the Tanakh was God's word? Did I believe that I had to be Orthodox? Could I be something else, And but I did embrace eventually Torah Judaism. I like to joke with my audience because at this point they're probably getting sleepy, and I say I converted to Buddhism, and they all laugh. And, but no, and then so I'm married to a Christian man. I had brought my mom and my dad and my sister to.
Okay, what about the family?
It was a whole big thing, but the biggest thing was at that point my kids were 6, 8, 10, and 12 years old. My son was less than a year from bar mitzvah. And I knew that the synagogue was not going to bar mitzvah him if he still believed in Jesus. So my first priority was to talk with him about all of these things that I had discovered and to encourage him. And because I was a homeschooling mom, I was able to assign him to encourage him to go through these verses and to come up with his own belief system. And he did. And he decided that Judaism was the truth. And so he was bar mitzvahed a year later. And during
at the same shul.
At the same shul. Well, yeah, the bar mitzvah was in the shul, and then we had a backyard barbecue because fortunately, my son's birthday is in June and not January, because it was the only way that we could have the community join us because they were unsure about what to do with us, even though I had become religious. My husband was still a Christian. And but meanwhile, I was also talking to my mom and dad about the things that I was discovering. And my dad was bound and determined to prove that the Jews were actually mistaken. So I would come to him and I'd say, "Hey, Dad, have you looked at this about the virgin birth?" And he would say, "Well, I'll take a look at it." And he was going to prove that the Jewish interpretation of that passage was wrong. And he would come back and say, "Actually, you're right. The Jews are right." And one by one, his beliefs were changing. And his congregation, because he began to teach differently, his congregation started dropping off one by one. By the time of my son's bar mitzvah, there were only a few people left in the congregation. And I had managed to give a pretty convincing explanation to my father. And even though my husband really did not like Mark at all, because he had featured so prominently in our life during that 10 months, we did invite him to the bar mitzvah. And so during the bar mitzvah, I looked out the window and I noticed that Mark was talking with my parents. And a few hours later, I looked out the window again and he was still talking with my parents. And what happened was my dad had pretty much been convinced by the discussions that we had had, but he still had a few remaining questions, and he was picking Mark's brain, and Mark was clarifying these answers for him. Excuse me. And so by the end of the bar mitzvah party, my parents had decided to come back to Judaism as well. And but not my husband. My husband never had any doubts. He was a true believer. He was a Christian.
And these arguments, and I imagine you would talk with it,
Oh, yeah.
The pillow talk about,
Oh,
all these.
my gosh. You have no idea
And
if
so
you
he
had
was
been a
just
fly
not-
on the wall. Let me tell you, before I came back to Judaism, my husband and I had an amazing relationship. We never argued. Not that we didn't disagree, but we never fought. And now everything I said offended him and everything he said offended me. And we were fighting all the time. And everybody was convinced that we absolutely were going to get divorced, not because of the difference in faith as much as because of the fighting. And so 2 years after I came back to Judaism, so a year after the bar mitzvah, my husband and I are having one of our standard fights, and he made me really angry. I don't even remember what it was now. He made me really angry, and I responded to him by saying, "Oh, you just say that because you're a Christian."
Wow.
Yeah. To which he said to me, "Actually, no, I'm not." And I was like, "Wait, what?" He said, "No, really." He said, "Over the past 2 years, you've given me enough reason to doubt the validity of the New Testament. I cannot believe in Jesus anymore." He said, "But I don't necessarily believe Judaism is the truth with a capital T. I'm not ready to trade one flawed religion for another." And so, but at that point, his status had changed in the community. He was now considered what we call a Noahide or a Ben Noach, a righteous Gentile who believes in God and the Jewish Torah, but is not necessarily convinced he needs to convert to Judaism.
Sure.
But that status change helped us to start to change in the community. We were able to start taking classes. We took a lot of classes at the Etz Center with Rabbi Porter,
Sure.
right? And long story short, 2.5 years after that, 4.5 years after I came back to Judaism, he did decide that Judaism was the truth with a capital T, and he converted to Judaism, and Paul Michael Taylor became Pinchas Moshe under the chuppah at the Etz Center. We were the first wedding at the new Etz Center. Yeah.
And Rabbi
Yeah.
Porter
Yeah.
did the service?
Yeah. Rabbi Porter did his conversion and Rabbi Porter was the Masada Kedushin for our wedding. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So where have you gone since then? Obviously, you're no longer in Baltimore. You mentioned you're living near Jerusalem.
Correct.
So obviously some things changed there. And
Yeah.
where's your life gone?
Oh, so I mean, long story there also because after I started working for Jews for Judaism. I worked for Jews for Judaism for 1.5 years, and then we decided to make Aliyah. And again, this is a whole nother talk, and we really probably don't have a lot of time for that. But after we moved to Israel, I started my own counter-missionary organization. And but at some point, as I began doing a lot of personal growth work, a lot of work on my own healing, because I had to deal with a lot of trauma and abuse that had happened in my own life. And as I began to deal with that, I realized that I really didn't want to spend my life tearing something down, which is what being a counter missionary is, right? You're tearing Christianity down. What I wanted to do was build people up. I decided that I wanted to devote my life. I still wanted to devote my life to making a tikkun for what I had done and to help Jews become better Jews, better connected Jews, connected to Hashem and Torah and mitzvot. But I decided that I wanted to do it a different way. Instead of tearing down Christianity, I wanted to spend my life building people up. And so I moved into more inspirational speaking and teaching and motivational. I don't like the word motivational because motivation actually comes from within inside you, not from without. But But I wrote a book because there was a lot of demand for that. And
What's it called?
It's called Coming Full Circle, and it's available on Amazon. If you go today, it probably says out of stock. But if you wait, I'll have to go and
Couple
fix
days.
that. Yeah, wait a couple of days, or on my website. You can order it on my website, and I'll send it out.
Which is what?
It's PeninaTaylor.com, and then just go to shop, and the book is available there.
Penina's with an E, P-E-N, or just
PeninaTaylor.com. And there's a few things in there. And if anybody wants me to come and speak, obviously they can contact me through there.
And you mentioned to me earlier that you have earlier in this talk that you have a podcast of your own. Tell us about that.
I do. It's wonderful. It's called Leap of Faith. It airs on Israel.
I thought it was going to be Taylor Talk or Taylor Time. Leap of Faith. Okay.
Leap of Faith. It's on Israel News Talk Radio.
Yep.
And basically, I interview people about their journey to Torah. So it's only about their journey to Torah, whereas other podcasts interview people with just incredible stories.
Sure.
And I interview converts. I interview, Balei Tshuva returnees. And I even have some non-Jews, some Noahides who have left Christianity or other faiths and decided to become we call this students of the 7 mitzvah, observers of the 7 mitzvos of Noahides. But it's a really incredible experience spending your life. So many people bring me out to tell my own story that it's really wonderful to spend time interviewing people about their stories.
Sure.
Because you discover that people are amazing and complex and everybody has a story. Of course, some stories are more entertaining and more interesting, and some people tell their stories better than others, but everybody has a story. And so right now there are 50 approximately, because I'm coming in on my 1-year anniversary.
Nice, 50 episodes, huh?
Yeah, and they're all podcasted. So it airs live on Sunday mornings. New York time is 10 a.m. Israel time is 5 p.m.
And then you release them as a podcast.
And then it's released as a podcast.
Awesome.
So you can go to israelnewstalkradio.com, Leap of Faith, and you can see all of those. And my story, of course, is the first one. One of them, I interviewed my oldest son, who considers himself a born again twice, if you will, Balei Tshuva again. Because
how old are your children now?
Now you're going to ask me to tell my age.
Not your age, just theirs. You
Yeah,
could've had
well,
them at-
I had them at 10.
extrapolation.
I had them at 10.
We know that's not true because we got the story.
Right, exactly. No, my kids are now 26, 28, 30, and almost 32.
Wow.
And
Are married?
they're all
Christian?
married. They're
married.
all religious. They all live in Israel, although my youngest is currently spending some time in America with his in-laws, his wife and her family. But they all live in Israel. They all have children. We just saw the birth of our ninth
Beautiful.
Our ninth grandchild, yeah. And I don't feel old enough to have
No,
nine
you don't look old
grandchildren.
enough either. That's
Thank
fine.
you.
That's incredible.
But yeah, and so I'm currently on this speaking tour in the United States. I'm coming back. It looks like I have an invitation for Pennsylvania in February. So if anybody would like to have me come speak in February in your community, please spread the word that I'm open. And that means you don't have to pay for me to come from Israel. You just have to pay for me to come from New York. So yeah.
And what's next for you? Any other projects that you're kind of looking towards, and what haven't you done yet that you want to do?
Well, at this point, I'm hoping to get out a few more books. I have a list of about a dozen, believe it or not, based on talks that I've given of personal growth within the context of Torah. I also put together, because I've done so much work on myself and I teach and I coach, that I discovered about 5 years ago that I really had enough material to have a full day personal growth workshop.
Sure.
And because I feel like my life changed trajectory because of the work that I learned, what I learned and the work that I did, I really wanted to make this accessible to people. You know, when you look at Tony Robbins, first of all, you have all these secular gurus, but it's not Torah oriented. And we do have a few Torah-based personal growth workshops.
Yom Tov Glazer doing
right,
one,
exactly.
and,
I actually worked with Yom Tov Glazer for 3 years.
Okay, cool. So he's been on the podcast.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah. I interviewed him live also, actually, at his house in Jerusalem, in Nachlaot, at about 1 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday
oh my gosh,
night.
that sounds... Yeah.
The place was hopping.
Yeah, that sounds like Rabbi Glazer. It was an honor to work with him. I worked
Yeah.
with him for 3 years, presenting about half of his material when he had women's. When he did women's, he didn't want to be the sole presenter when it was a women's seminar, and that makes sense. And I was also his head coach during that time, so I trained the coaches and stuff like that.
And Daniel Katz has one, and there's
right,
different ones out
exactly.
there.
But they are very, very in depth, and there is definitely a need for that. As I worked with him, I had my own additional breakthroughs, and I learned a tremendous amount from him. I consider him my mentor, and I didn't plagiarize. I used only my own original materials, some of which I developed for his seminar when I was teaching it, but a lot of it was just stuff that I had taught and used in coaching over the years. And I realized about 5 years ago that I had enough to put together a full day seminar. So I wanted to make this very beginning level knowledge available and accessible to people and affordable. And so, you know, of course, it's to my own detriment because it means I'm not getting wealthy from it, but it does mean that I'm accomplishing the thing that I feel like I was created in this world to accomplish, which is to inspire people towards a healthier relationship with themselves and with God and with the Jewish people.
Have you had any interaction with either Shira Gura or Chaya Hinda Allen?
Not directly, but of course I've heard of.
I've interviewed both of them, and they
well, right. So Shira, I actually had a coaching opportunity at one point very early on, but so I made this full day workshop. Right now I'm going to be giving one in Houston. If any of your listeners are in Houston, there's still tickets available. Please, I need a minimum number of people to make it worthwhile. And so I still need a few more people to buy tickets for Houston. That's February 15th. It's a Sunday. That's this coming Sunday. I don't even know if this is going to air by then.
December 15th.
Yeah, December 15th. But it's all day. And then the 16th and 17th, I'm doing it as 2 pieces in the evenings in Las Vegas. But I'm happy to come back out in February and do either a full day workshop or a 2-evening workshop for any community that would like to do it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it sounds like quite the saga. You've done, quite full circle. Has anyone that you were really close to kind of remained in the Christian world? How about your sister?
My sister is still a believer. But we have a fantastic relationship. Every time I come back to the States to speak, I try. It doesn't happen every time, but I try to spend time with her.
Where does she live now?
And she lives in Western Maryland. And I remember there was one time she had pneumonia, And I came and I spent 2 weeks with her and helped her. And it was really fabulous because at the end of our visit, she and I were both in tears. We were going to miss each other, of course. And she turned to me and she said, you've really changed my view of Orthodox Jews. She said, I no longer believe that you're going to hell. And I felt like we've made progress.
That's a step.
And the cool thing is my sister and I have this unspoken agreement, if you will. We talk about God, and we talk about religion within the Jewish context. We don't talk about anything that we don't both agree on. And we have a wonderful visit with each other, and we love each other, and we spend time with each other. And the parts that we don't agree on, we just, we've got so much more in common than her belief in Jesus, and whether or not I do. And I think that that's like a really important lesson. If you have a close friend or a family member who doesn't share your beliefs. And this is actually a principle from Rabbi Glazer, and that is that we have to learn the difference between acceptance and approval. And you can accept and love somebody for who they are without approving of all of their choices. And that's a really important concept for us to wrap our heads around. Just because I love them does not necessarily mean I have to approve of everything they do. And so you can have relationships with people based on other things besides your faith.
Just in closing, I mean, how do you deal with the fact that kind of you were sort of the propagator of those kinds of things? Not to guilt you, obviously. You were.
No, I have plenty of guilt over that.
I'm sure you're Jewish, so
Yeah, right.
Obviously, you were doing all these things out of profound sincerity.
Right,
and so
exactly.
It's kind of hard to blame yourself when you didn't have that education. You were, promoting what you truly and sincerely believed to be correct.
Yes.
Nevertheless, I imagine there's that just inherent sense of feeling, I caused somebody to do something which I just now profoundly disagree with.
Right.
How do you kind of square with that?
So fortunately for me, it's funny. I had an interview with Huffington Post once, and that was one of the questions that they asked. And the answer that I gave was that I do regret that I had not brought all of the Jews that I had brought to Christianity back to Judaism. Although, thank God, I did have the opportunity to reconnect with a few of them and to bring them back. But the vast majority of people that I brought to Christianity were not Jewish. The vast majority of them were non-Jews. And while I still regret that as well, that is not as big of a deal. And the primary, I was accused by the watchers of the readers of Huffington Post of being a racist because I cared about the Jews and not the non-Jews. But the truth is, of course, Judaism doesn't believe you have to be Jewish in order to have a relationship with God. So I believe that if they're sincerely connecting with God, even if it's misunderstood through Jesus, they're fine, right? Judaism believes that all the righteous have a place in the kingdom of heaven. So, it's, but I mean, that is why I devoted my life to trying to help Jews to come back from Judaism. At first, it was actually arguing against Christianity, but there are plenty of people who do that and do a very good job at that. Whether you're talking about Michael Skobac or Tovia Singer. Exactly. And of course, when I'm asked, I will. And frequently I'm brought in by the the Israeli counter-missionary organization Yad Lachim when they, especially if they have a woman who's an English speaker, I'm a very appropriate choice to talk with them. And so I will. I do definitely. So that's why I devoted my life to making that tikkun, that repair, by trying to build Jews up and help them to have this healthy and strong and meaningful and relevant relationship with Hashem within the context of Judaism.
Beautiful. Well, Penina Taylor, this certainly went longer than I think both of us expected. But I enjoyed every minute, and I know that our listeners did as well.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
This has been Ari Koretsky on Jews You Should Know. Please visit us at JewsYouShouldKnow.com and subscribe at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you consume podcasts. Find us on social media at Jews You Should Know. If you'd like to become a supporter of this podcast, we would greatly appreciate that, and you can do so by visiting patreon.com. That's patreon.com/JewsYouShouldKnow. Finally, if you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review so that we can continue to grow and introduce many more people to Jews You Should Know.